40. That is how many naked human bodies George Patton's own diary says were stacked inside a single shed at a camp called Ohrdruf on a day in April 1945 when the shed itself had room for 200. Patton wrote that number down himself, in his own hand, along with the fact that the bodies had been lightly dusted with lime, not to destroy them, but simply to cut the smell enough that the guards could stand to walk past. Patton had commanded tanks through North Africa, Sicily, and France. He had seen dead men in every kind of condition a battlefield produces. At Ohrdruf, he walked partway into one building, stopped, and would not go any further. Nobody who knew his reputation expected that reaction from him, least of all the officers standing next to him at the time. We're going to tell you everything about what he saw that day today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start at the beginning, and then we'll move from there. This was not supposed to be found by anyone outside the SS. In November 1944, in the wooded hills near the small Thuringian town of Ohrdruf, the SS opened a new subcamp of Buchenwald under the code name S3. Its purpose was construction, not extermination in the industrialized sense of Auschwitz, but the distinction meant almost nothing to the men who were sent there. By late 1944, the German High Command had grown convinced its existing headquarters complex outside Berlin was no longer safe from Allied bombing and the approaching Soviet front, and Hitler wanted a new one, dug into the hills, far enough underground that nothing dropped from the air could reach it. S3 existed to build it, a tunnel and bunker complex with shafts more than 1.5 miles long, entrances disguised on the surface to look like ordinary alpine chalets. The project had its own name too, Olga, and by late February 1945, elements of the German Army High Command had actually begun moving staff into the finished sections, even as the war that headquarters was meant to help run was already being lost on every front at once. The prisoners who dug it came from the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Belgium, Greece, Yugoslavia, and a dozen other occupied countries. And by March 1945, the camp's own records put the population above 11,000, though other survivor and camp accounts describe closer to 20,000 men passing through in total across its 5 months of operation. They worked around the clock in rotating shifts because the bunker was needed urgently, underground, on starvation rations, in tunnels that never had enough ventilation or timber supports, digging by hand and by drill for a headquarters that would ultimately shelter German staff officers for a matter of weeks before the war ended anyway. Guards beat men for working too slowly and shot men outright for collapsing where an officer could see it happen. More than 3,000 of them died inside Ohrdruf itself, from exhaustion, from beatings, from executions meant to keep the rest moving faster. Thousands more, judged too sick or too weak to keep digging, were shipped out to Bergen-Belsen or to the overflow barracks at Buchenwald itself, officially reclassified as unfit for work, a specific administrative phrase that generally preceded death by a matter of weeks rather than saving anyone from it. Historians who have added the confirmed camp deaths to the prisoners transferred out to die elsewhere put the total closer to 7,000 in a camp that had existed for less than 5 months. A typical day inside the tunnels began before dawn with a roll call that could last an hour by itself. Prisoners standing in whatever clothing they had through the Thuringian winter, while guards counted and recounted numbers that never quite matched because men had died overnight and not yet been accounted for. Then came the walk to the tunnel entrances, disguised as chalets. Then a shift underground that could run 12 hours, hauling rock and timber by hand in passages barely tall enough to stand upright in, on a ration that camp survivors later described as barely enough to keep a resting man alive, let alone one swinging a pick for half a day. Men who slowed were beaten. Men who collapsed and could not be revived quickly were shot where they lay, in front of the men working beside them, as a lesson about the cost of slowing down. None of that was visible from the outside. No accounts of Ohrdruf reached Allied intelligence in any real detail before American tanks were already approaching it. What triggered the killing that Americans would find evidence of within days was not policy handed down from Berlin in advance. It was panic, on the ground, as the front line got close enough that the SS guards running the camp understood they were about to lose control of it entirely. On April 1st, 1945, with the American Third Army only days away, the SS began marching almost the entire remaining prisoner population out of Ohrdruf toward Buchenwald, on foot, with no food and no plan for what to do with anyone who could not keep the pace. SS guards, men from the Volkssturm Home Guard, and in some accounts members of the Hitler Youth, walked alongside columns of starving men for miles of open road, and shot the ones who fell behind or simply could not stand back up once they had gone down. Historians estimate roughly 1,000 men were killed on that march alone, left in ditches and fields along a route the retreating guards did not have time or reason to hide, in the final days of a war that both sides already knew was ending. Local German civilians along that same stretch of road would later claim, when asked, that they had not seen anything unusual pass by that week. The prisoners left behind at Ohrdruf were the ones judged too sick to march at all, held in a section of the camp called the Nordlager. What happened to them did not require a written order, because the SS guards handling it did not leave one behind. They told the remaining prisoners they were being gathered to receive food. They walked them out onto the parade ground under that pretense, and then shot them where they stood, and left the bodies lying in the open where they fell. Some corpses found afterward had been partially burned in an attempt to destroy the evidence before the Americans arrived. There was not enough time left to finish the job. On April 4, 1945, troops from the 4th Armored Division, the 89th Infantry Division, and the 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalion reached Ohrdruf and found what was left. Almost the entire prisoner population was gone, marched out 3 days earlier, but the corpses that remained testified to what the place had actually been. Decomposing bodies lay across the parade ground and inside the barracks, some of them lightly covered in lime, some of them showing the scorching of the fire meant to destroy them. One of the American soldiers among the first through the gate, a combat correspondent named Meyer Levin, wrote afterward that they had all heard vague rumors before that morning, that the world had vaguely heard, but that until they actually stood there and looked, none of them had truly imagined they would see it, and that it felt as though they had finally reached the center of something he could only describe as a black heart. Soldiers who spoke with the handful of prisoners too weak to have been marched out described faces that had gone past gaunt into something closer to skulls, eyes so sunken they looked like dark holes staring out of the skin, bodies covered in insects that nobody bothered anymore to brush away. Word reached Patton's Third Army headquarters within days, and Patton went to see it himself before the more famous, more photographed visit that came a week later. What he wrote afterward in his own diary is one of the more direct, first-hand American accounts of any camp discovered in 1945, and it does not read like a man softening what he saw for the record. He described a shed holding about 40 completely naked human bodies in the last stages of emaciation, lightly sprinkled with lime, not to destroy them, he specified, but simply to control the smell. He noted that the shed, when full, held roughly 200 bodies before they were carted to a pit a mile away and buried. He wrote that the inmates who survived told him 3,000 men had been killed by gunshot to the head or by starvation and buried in that pit since the 1st of January alone, a figure covering barely 3 months. Patton was 59 years old in the spring of 1945. And had commanded soldiers through some of the ugliest fighting of the war in North Africa, Sicily, and France. He had seen burned tank crews, seen the aftermath of artillery barrages on infantry caught in the open, seen frozen dead stacked at the roadside during the bulge. At Ohrdruf, in front of one particular room, where 20 or 30 more starved bodies were piled, he stopped and would not go inside. He told the officers with him plainly that he would get sick if he did. He walked behind a nearby building instead and vomited. The general who had built his entire reputation on refusing to look away from anything the war put in front of him found the one room at Ohrdruf that he simply could not make himself enter. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. A week later, on April 12, 1945, Patton returned to Ohrdruf with Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley walking beside him, the 3 most senior American commanders in the European theater, touring the same rooms together at the same time. Eisenhower had not originally planned to make camp visits a personal priority in the middle of directing an active advance into Germany, but once he saw Ohrdruf himself, his own later account makes clear something shifted in how he understood what his job now included. He wrote afterward that what he saw there beggared description, and that while walking through the camp, he had come across 3 men who had been prisoners there and had escaped through one ruse or another before the evacuation, and that he sat down through an interpreter and made them tell him everything. The visual evidence in front of him, combined with what those 3 men described, starvation used deliberately, cruelty for its own sake, degradations he did not fully spell out even in his own account, left him, in his own words, feeling a bit sick himself. Bradley, walking the same rooms, said almost nothing publicly at the time, in keeping with a man who rarely performed his reactions for an audience. But he never forgot the visit either, and referenced it for years afterward as the clearest possible answer to anyone who ever asked him what the war had actually been for. Eisenhower said something closer to that thought out loud, on the spot. He told the officers around him that the American soldier was often described as a man who did not really know what he was fighting for, and that now, at least, he knew what he was fighting against. That sentence turned out to be the least consequential thing Eisenhower did that week. What mattered more was a decision he made almost immediately afterward, one clearly built on an instinct that this evidence would eventually be challenged by people who had never set foot near Ohrdruf. He ordered that every American unit in the area not actively engaged at the front be marched through the camp in person, so that as many soldiers as possible would be able to say, for the rest of their lives, that they had seen it directly, rather than heard about it secondhand. He wrote later that he had made the visit deliberately, so that he would be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if the stories were ever dismissed in the future as mere propaganda. He was documenting the war's worst secret with the specific expectation that someone, someday, would try to claim it never happened. It was an unusual instinct for a general in the middle of an active campaign to have, planning for an argument that would not happen for decades. But it turned out to be exactly the right one. Denial of what the camps contained began circulating within a generation of the war ending, and every photograph, every reel of Signal Corps film, every diary page Eisenhower insisted on preserving became part of the answer to it. He also ordered every Signal Corps photographer and cameraman who could reach the area to record everything before a single body was moved. The raw footage they shot at Ohrdruf that week became some of the earliest camp liberation film the U.S. Army had, and it was edited into newsreels with titles like Camps of the Dead that ran in movie theaters across the United States and Britain within weeks, alongside the newsreel footage, playing in front of ordinary audiences who had gone to the cinema expecting a Hollywood picture, and instead watched several minutes of exactly what Patton had refused to walk into. Some theaters reported audiences sitting in total silence afterward. Others reported people walking out before the newsreel finished. Newspapers back in the United States ran the photographs on front pages within days, not buried in later sections the way earlier, vaguer atrocity reports sometimes had been. Editors who had spent years being cautious about unverified refugee accounts of German brutality, wary of repeating the kind of unconfirmed rumor that had circulated and then been picked apart after the First War, now had American soldiers' own photographs and an American general's own diary to print instead. The caution disappeared almost overnight. What had been treated for years as claims requiring verification was now treated as established fact, because the men making the claims were wearing American uniforms and had seen it with their own eyes. On April 19th, a week after his own visit, Eisenhower sent a cable to General George Marshall in Washington, asking that members of Congress and American journalists be sent to the newly liberated camps to see the evidence for themselves before the bodies were buried and the barracks torn down. Marshall took the request directly to congressional leadership, and a bipartisan delegation departed for Germany on April 23rd. Among them, Senator Alben Barkley, Senator Walter George, Senator Elbert Thomas, Republican leader Wallace White, Leverett Saltonstall, Kenneth Wary, and Representatives Dewey Short, Ewing Thomason, James Mott, and James Richards. Within days of Eisenhower's request, both that congressional delegation and a separate group of American journalists were walking the same ground Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley had walked, and their published reports and photographs became some of the first detailed accounts most Americans at home ever read about what had actually been happening behind German lines. There was one more group the local American command insisted on marching through the camp, and it was not American at all. Soldiers rounded up German civilians from the town of Ohrdruf itself, a town close enough to the camp that its existence had never been any kind of secret to the people living beside it, and walked them past the same rooms, the same pit, the same partially burned bodies the SS had not had time to finish disposing of. Many of the townspeople insisted, in front of American officers, that they had known nothing about what was happening less than 2 miles from their own front doors. American soldiers who escorted the tours described faces that did not look surprised so much as afraid of what came next. A handful reportedly broke down in tears on the spot, in front of American soldiers who had little sympathy left to spare for anyone who lived within walking distance of what they had just finished cataloging. The mayor of Ohrdruf was among the civilians marched through. He and his wife went home afterward. According to multiple contemporary American press accounts filed within days of the event, they first attempted to cut their wrists, and when that did not end things quickly enough, hanged themselves in their own house. A note was reportedly found nearby. It said, "We didn't know, but we knew." Nobody who left that note behind was alive to explain exactly what it meant. Whether it was confession, excuse, or something closer to an apology written by 2 people who had run out of ways to keep pretending, it captured, in 5 words, something that entire post-war trials would spend years failing to fully resolve about how a town lives beside something like Ohrdruf without admitting it sees it. Other towns near other camps produced their own versions of the same denial in the weeks that followed, and historians studying the pattern since have generally concluded the same thing the American soldiers on the scene suspected at the time, that a camp employing thousands of prisoners within walking distance of a small town's houses and shops was not the kind of thing its neighbors failed to notice by accident. The camp itself had never been a secret extermination facility on the scale of Auschwitz or Treblinka, and the men who built S3 were killed by exhaustion and executions far more than by an assembly line of gas chambers. That distinction did not matter to the soldiers who found it, and it did not matter to Eisenhower either. What Ohrdruf gave the Allies, at a moment before Buchenwald itself, before Bergen-Belsen, before Dachau, was the first direct, documented, photographed proof, discovered and recorded by American units themselves, rather than described secondhand by refugees or partisans, that everything the wartime rumors had described was not exaggeration. A Polish survivor who had stayed behind, too weak to march, walked American officers personally to the specific spots where prisoners had been beaten and executed, narrating what had happened at each one while the soldiers wrote it down. It set the pattern for how every camp found after it was going to be treated, filmed, and preserved as evidence, rather than simply cleared and forgotten as one more unpleasant scene among thousands that a retreating army leaves behind. Accountability, when it came, arrived slowly and mostly at a distance. Ohrdruf's own guards largely scattered or vanished into the general collapse of the German war effort in its final weeks, and few, if any, were ever individually tried under that name. But the wider system Ohrdruf belonged to did face a reckoning. In 1947, at Dachau, an American military tribunal tried 31 men and 1 woman connected to Buchenwald and its network of subcamps, among them Camp Commandant Hermann Pister. 22 of them were sentenced to death. It was not a trial about Ohrdruf specifically, and no verdict from that courtroom could reach back and undo what had already happened in the shed Patton would not enter. It was the closest the machinery of post-war justice ever came to answering for it. 1 week after Ohrdruf, on April 11, 1945, American forces reached Buchenwald itself, the main camp Ohrdruf had always technically belonged to, and found tens of thousands of survivors still alive inside it. A very different scene from the emptied barracks and scattered dead of Ohrdruf, but no less devastating to the soldiers who walked in. Bergen-Belsen fell to British troops 4 days after that. Dachau was reached by the Americans in the closing weeks of April. Each discovery added its own scale and its own horror to what Eisenhower had already set in motion after Ohrdruf. But it was Ohrdruf that came first. Ohrdruf that produced the first photographs, the first congressional cable, the first newsreels, simply by accident of geography, because it happened to sit closest to the line of Patton's advance in the first week of April. The 3,000 claimed by survivors to have been killed since January alone, the roughly 7,000 total the historical accounting eventually settled on, the 1,000 shot along the road to Buchenwald in the war's final week, none of those numbers were confirmed with documents from Berlin, because the SS at Ohrdruf did not leave behind orders describing what they had done. What they left behind was the physical evidence itself, the shed, the pit, the parade ground, and it was left behind specifically because there had not been enough time to finish hiding it before the tanks arrived. The Americans who found it understood immediately that this was the point. They photographed everything before it could be buried, cleaned, or explained away, and those photographs and film reels were later entered directly into evidence at the Nuremberg trials, among the first visual documentation of camp conditions any tribunal anywhere had ever seen. Eisenhower himself returned to Ohrdruf in his later writing more than once, long after he had left the army and become president, and the language he used never softened the way memories of difficult wartime decisions sometimes do with distance. He wrote that he had deliberately sought out every detail of it because he did not trust his own capacity, or anyone else's, to describe it adequately from second-hand reports, and that he wanted to be able to give first-hand testimony himself if it was ever needed. He got his wish in a way he probably did not fully anticipate in April 1945. Testimony describing what he personally saw at Ohrdruf has been cited for decades since, in classrooms, in documentaries, and in formal legal contexts, specifically because it came from a five-star general willing to put his own name and his own eyes behind it, rather than leaving the historical record to rely only on the accounts of the survivors and the perpetrators. Patton, for his part, never wrote or spoke about Ohrdruf as a turning point in his understanding of the war, the way Eisenhower's public statements suggested it had been for him. His diary entry is clinical, specific, almost procedural, numbers and descriptions without the kind of reflection Eisenhower offered afterward. But the fact that he would not walk into that one room, the general who had spent 3 years insisting there was no scene of war he would not personally inspect, said something his own writing never tried to put into words. Some things did not need a general's commentary attached to them. They only needed someone willing to write down exactly what was there, and Patton did that much, in detail, in his own hand, within days of seeing it. The soldiers of the 4th Armored, the 89th Infantry, and the 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, who were first through the gate, carried what they saw for the rest of their lives, in the specific way that men who saw Ohrdruf tended to describe it decades later, not as a single memory, but as a set of physical details that never faded, the way other wartime memories eventually did. Some of them gave interviews 50 years afterward, old men by then, and still stopped mid-sentence at the same points in the story every time, unable to finish a description they had otherwise repeated for school children and historians dozens of times before. They remembered the smell before they remembered anything else. A smell some of them said they could still recall perfectly decades later, on days when nothing else about the war came back to them clearly at all. They remembered survivors too weak to stand, who tried anyway, when they understood American soldiers had actually arrived, reaching for a uniform sleeve as if to check it was real. They remembered counting bodies, because someone had to, and losing count, and starting over. They remembered being ordered to walk German civilians from the town through the same rooms, and watching faces that did not look shocked so much as caught. They remembered young soldiers, some of them barely out of high school themselves, coming out of the barracks and being unable to speak for a while afterward, and older soldiers who had already survived the worst infantry fighting of the war in the Ardennes, finding this different in a way none of them could fully explain to people back home who had not seen it. They remembered a general everyone had built up in their minds as fearless, walking to a shed, stopping, and turning away. Some of them, asked years later by their own grandchildren what the worst day of the war had been, did not answer with a battle at all. They answered with a shed, a pit, and a smell, and found that was usually enough of an answer that nobody asked a follow-up question. The camp itself is difficult to visit today. The site has belonged to the German army since 1993, a restricted training ground closed to casual visitors, and Soviet occupation authorities razed much of the original camp structure decades before that, leaving only a handful of the old munitions bunkers that had briefly doubled as prisoner housing, and a mass grave marked now by a single memorial plaque. A local historical association has spent recent years digitizing what prisoner records survive, one name at a time, in an effort to make sure a place the public still mostly cannot walk into does not simply disappear from the record, the way the SS tried to make the bodies disappear in the first days of April 1945. The building Patton would not enter is gone. The ground underneath it is still there, and still, in its own way, closed. We should not forget. Did your father or grandfather serve with the units that liberated Ohrdruf or any of the camps found in the spring of 1945? Tell us his name in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.